This is a story that needs to be told to the entire country because California has spoken. We do not want drilling off of our shores, but the federal government, the rest of this country via laws enacted in Congress, the rest of this country is putting our coasts at risk. This was a federal spill, and there have been a lot of federal spills. Here's Vipe Desai of the Business Alliance for Protecting the Pacific Coast.
In fact, between 2007 and 2018, there were over 7,000 oil spills in federal waters, an average of about 2 every day.
Only about a third of active pipelines have pressure sensor technology for leak detection, leaving over 5,700 miles of undersea fossil fuel pipelines without leak detection technology in the Gulf of Mexico. Even worse, the GAO report said, quote, existing regulations do not allow the Bureau to compel the implementation of these technologies or their successors on existing or future pipelines, unquote. And so the police aren't even empowered to tell the fossil fuel companies that they have to put this technology on their equipment. We have laws, but administration after administration are waiving them.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can't stick to your story if you think it flies. But I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 242nd episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. This is a podcast that's about Congress, and I've been doing this now for almost 10 years. Next year will be the 10th year of Congressional Dish. And essentially what I was doing is I was watching hearings and had started looking into bills and laws, like actually reading the text, and was finding all sorts of things that I felt were really important that I wasn't hearing about through any corporate media outlets. And so that was making me insane. And so I started this podcast just wondering if other people would be interested in what I was finding. It turns out that they are, because we do now have this podcast that has existed for a decade, 100% because of all of the producers who have participated in the value for value funding model that we operate on here, because I don't take any corporate advertisements. That's what poisoned the corporate media. So we're not going to do that here. Instead, I produce a podcast essentially for free, and the audience provides whatever they feel is fair for the value that they receive from each episode. And so first up, I just want to thank every single one of you that has participated in the value for value model and has made this podcast possible. I could not do this without you, especially those of you who have signed up to support on a regular basis. So just thank you so much. And if you are someone who gets value from this podcast, or if this is your first time listening, if you find that this episode is valuable to you, you can go and check out the show notes, because that is where I'm going to give you the sources for everything I tell you about. I feel like trust is earned. And so therefore, I provide you with my sources so you can see what I am reading, where I'm getting my information from. You can read the reports for yourself. You can find the timestamps for all these sound clips I'm going to play you so that you can watch them in the hearings in context. And I don't make you dig to find them. I tell you exactly where the clips start. I transcribe the clips for you. I'm trying to make it as easy as possible for you to check my work so that you can trust that what I'm telling you is true. And if you get value from that, you can go ahead and use any of the links to all of our funding methods in every episode show notes. We have a Patreon where you can get all of these episodes without the golf swing, censoring all my dirty words. But we also take, if you want to rack up those credit card miles, we take PayPal, Cash App, we have Venmo, we have Zelle, we accept paper checks. I mean, whatever works for you works for us. And thank you to anyone and everyone who has ever paid for this podcast. You guys, you give me a lot of hope. Now for this episode today, oh man, this one's personal for me. Basically, I'm producing this episode for Orange County, California, because, I know I've been doing this podcast for 10 years, and even those of you who have been with me since the beginning, it's always confusing for you when I say, like, where I'm from, it's because I've been all over the place. When you met me back in 2012, I was living in Boston. Then I lived in Oregon for a year. Then I lived in like the middle of nowhere, Oregon. Then I lived in the Bay Area for 6 years. And now I live wherever I feel like it. I am a digital nomad. So it's like, where is Jen Briney from? A lot of people don't know. Well, when I think of my home, like where I was raised, it's Orange County, California. I was born in Denver, but my parents moved to Orange County when I was 6. So I started first grade in Irvine, California, and my mother still lives there. So I am an Irvine girl. And there was an oil spill off of my hometown beaches that took place about 6 weeks ago. And, the national media has completely forgotten this story, not that they covered it all that much to begin with. And so I needed to follow up on it. I needed to find out what was going on in my community. And I do count Huntington Beach and Newport Beach and Laguna Beach and Seal Beach and all the beaches of Los Angeles. I count all of these as my home beaches because even though I was raised in Irvine, I went to a private school for 3 years of high school, my last 3 years of high school. And so going to a private school in Orange County, my friends were all over the place. I had friends in Rancho Santa Margarita and Anaheim Hills and Fullerton and all up and down the coast of Orange County. And so because of that, my hometown became Orange County. It really expanded the area where I hung out. And then I went to college at the beach in Los Angeles. And so that's where I'm recording right now. I just got back from a perfect day out there, out on the beach. I went for a run to gear up for this episode, and my soul is out there, man. Like, this is where I go to feel better. And I love these beaches. I love everything about them. And so, yeah, I needed to follow up on that story. And so in this episode, I'm going to reference some local locations more than I ordinarily would and give updates because people from my home are listening to this. And so I'm going to give updates to the people that can't be there and can't check it out for themselves. And because again, where do we find this information? It's just really not, anything that happens on the West Coast because the national media is all on the East Coast, it just gets forgotten. And this has definitely been memory hold. But the thing is that even if you don't care about Orange County and you're not here, like, don't really worry about it. Like, if you know these locations, and if you don't, it's fine because this episode is going to go like big picture eventually. Because researching what happened in Huntington Beach and Newport and Laguna and all the places that got oil on the sand, well, this led me down a whole offshore drilling rabbit hole. And I discovered some disturbing information about our offshore drilling police that I feel like I need to share with you today. And I guess it shouldn't surprise any of us who heard the episodes about how our government can't police pedophiles or deathbeds for babies. But the situation when it comes to offshore drilling is even worse than I expected, and I didn't exactly have high expectations, and you need to know about that. So that's really where this episode is headed today. This is a story that's bigger than Huntington Beach and California and even all of our coastlines. It's a story about state and local rights and how decisions are being made far away in Washington, D.C. on the country level that have consequences in our neighborhoods. But I want to start this story in my childhood neighborhoods on the beaches of Southern California, because that's where oil continues to wash up on our shores. The story of the Orange County oil spill really began a few years before I was born in 1980. When an oil drilling platform 8.6 miles off our coast named Ellie began operating. Now, this platform sits on top of a large reservoir of oil called the Beta Field. And because this platform is more than 3 miles off of our coast, it's policed by the U.S. Department of the Interior instead of California State. Platform Ellie is connected to a refinery in Long Beach by a 17.5-mile-long underwater pipeline. And on October 1st, that pipeline started leaking lots of oil into the ocean. This is Scott Brenneman, the owner of Westcott Fish, which is located basically at the Newport Beach Pier. And for you locals, it's near like Sharky's and where Blue Beat is. But he's testifying to the House Committee on Natural Resources, which held a joint subcommittee hearing in Irvine. So this wasn't in Washington, D.C. This was actually held locally by Representative Katie Porter at the Irvine Ranch Water District. And here's his testimony to that committee on October 18th.
We were fishing Friday, October 1st, and we were coming in the harbor, and I detected a distinct odor of oil, and it was about midnight when we were heading in. Kind of searched around the boat, thought maybe it was a spill on the boat or a hose broke. Went in the engine room, searched all the hatches where I keep all my extra fluids, everything. Didn't find anything. Come the next day, the press released that there was an actual oil spill, and my fish sales at my fish market, once that was released, they dropped drastically, down 90% this past few weeks since it was released. I've seen the same effect. My family's been fishing for 4 generations, and in the 90s, my dad went through the oil spill that was off Seal Beach in our fish market. The same exact response from the public. Scared, worried the product's contaminated, all the way up, the huge ripple effect, all the way up to the wholesalers I deal with outside of Orange County. They had concerns from their customers, their restaurants. And to rebuild that business, when it happened in the 90s, I watched my dad struggle for months to get it back to where it was. And I'm seeing the same exact thing happen here. A couple of days after the oil spill, they had closed the Newport Harbor. And so my boat was actually trapped inside of the harbor, so I wasn't even able to go service my accounts. And it's just been, to tell you the truth, a very difficult couple weeks, and I'm not sure how long this is going to last. I'm not sure how the public's going to respond to it long term, if they're still going to have some fear that the fish is contaminated.
Now, I'm recording this episode on November 12th, and the fisheries still haven't opened. Although Scott is able to fish because he's going further out in the ocean. I kind of looked into his business to see how he's doing. But he's not the only fishing business in Orange County. And so this is very much still an ongoing disaster for us. And so as you heard from Scott Brenneman, it was Friday night, October 1st, when people out on the ocean knew that there was an oil spill. A ship passing along the coast was the first to report a sheen of oil in the water at 6:13 p.m. on Friday night. Shortly after that, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration spotted a black blob on its satellite imagery, and they called it into regulators with a high confidence that it was oil. But the company that owns and operates the oil platforms and pipeline, Beta Offshore, which is owned by Amplify Energy, which is an independent company based in Texas, well, the first sign of trouble on their end seems to have occurred at 2:30 in the morning. So this would be Saturday morning, when employees received a low pressure alarm on their pipeline. According to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which oversees all oil pipelines, the pipeline was operating at about 30% of its maximum pressure when that alarm went off in the middle of the night. And so the company did shut down the pipeline more than 3 hours later at 6:01 a.m. Which tells me that if local fishermen, which included the Newport Beach mayor, by the way, were reporting oil on their boats on Friday night, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration was able to see the oil on satellite on Friday night, but that alarm didn't go off until 2:30 in the morning, it really makes me question the industry's leak detection technology. And apparently we should be questioning it. So this following clip is of Jacqueline Savitz. She is the Chief Policy Officer at Oceana, which is the largest international advocacy organization that focuses only on ocean conservation. And here she is testifying to the House Committee on Natural Resources on October 14th.
The leak detection technologies that the oil and gas industry touts as safer have not been proven to prevent major leaks. All pipelines in the Pacific region are reportedly equipped with advanced leak detection equipment. But 2 weeks ago, we saw exactly what can happen even with the so-called best technology.
So clearly, real life has shown us that this technology has already failed to detect a leak in real time to stop it from leaking significant amounts of oil for many hours. There's also a lack of technology, according to a Government Accountability Office report that was released in March, because it turns out that our offshore drilling police at the federal level are not even requiring any kind of technology for visual leak detection. And we know from the Deepwater Horizon disaster that it's possible to put cameras underwater that work. You know, we watched that gusher on the seafloor blasting oil into the ocean for months, but there's no cameras required to be down there monitoring the situation, monitoring the pipelines, despite the technology existing. Instead, the technology they use is only these pressure sensors that failed to detect the leak in the pipeline offshore Huntington Beach, because we know that that oil was out there hours before the alarm went off. And even though these sensors are clearly not amazing, at least they exist on all of the pipelines in the Pacific Ocean. Older pipelines in the Gulf of Mexico aren't compatible with these technologies. They can't have pressure sensors on them, and so they don't have pressure sensors on them. And we're not just talking about a few pipelines here in the Gulf of Mexico. Only about a third of active pipelines have pressure sensor technology for leak detection, leaving over 5,700 miles of undersea fossil fuel pipelines without leak detection technology in the Gulf of Mexico. Even worse, the GAO report said, quote, existing regulations do not allow the Bureau to compel the implementation of these technologies or their successors on existing or future pipelines, unquote. And so the police aren't even empowered to tell the fossil fuel companies that they have to put this technology on their equipment. They don't have that power. And that's something that Congress can change. But anyway, back to the Orange County spill. So on Friday night, October 1st, starting at 6 p.m., local fishermen knew there was an oil spill. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration saw the oil spill on their satellites. By 2:30 a.m. Saturday morning, Beta Offshore / Amplify Energy had a pressure alarm tell them that their pipeline was operating at 30% capacity, and they had shut off the pipeline 3 hours later. 2 hours after the pipeline was shut off, employees at Beta Offshore / Amplify Energy saw oil on the ocean at 8:09 a.m. But when they saw it, they didn't call the federal government or California State or any of the seaside cities. Instead, they dialed that company's risk management firm. They called corporate to see what to do. And that could be a crime, because any delay in notifying authorities of an oil spill violates federal law, which requires anyone in charge of an offshore facility to notify the National Response Center, quote, as soon as he or she has knowledge of any discharge of oil, unquote. But with no knowledge that any of this was going on just a few miles offshore, without any knowledge that oil had been leaking for at least 14 hours, Huntington Beach was preparing to host literally millions of people on the sand. The mayor of Huntington Beach, Kim Carr, testified to the California State Senate on October 28th. And yes, I watched a state hearing for this one. But here is what she told our state senators on October 28th.
So starting off on Saturday, October 2nd, it's been brought up that, yes, we did have a very large air show happening that day. About 1.5 million people were on the beach that day to see the Pacific Air Show. And around 9 o'clock that morning, there were city personnel that heard an announcement on VHF Channel 16 by the Coast Guard of a possible oil spill in the area, but nothing very specific at that time, no major details. It wasn't anything to really worry about. By 10:30 in the morning, the Coast Guard had advised us that the spill was larger than originally thought. However, we didn't have a whole lot of information as to where the location of the spill was, nor of the scope of the situation. By 11 o'clock that same day, the Coast Guard advised us that it was now going to be a major spill and that the incident management team was being activated. At 2 o'clock, the Coast Guard had advised us that the oil spill would not be reaching the shores of Huntington Beach until Monday, October 4th. And again, we didn't have a whole lot of information as to where the spill was. We knew it was off our coast, but we didn't know exactly where or exactly how large the spill was. But then, interestingly enough, just a half hour later, we started to receive messages that there were boats that were experiencing oil damage just outside of the air show flight box. And so that became a concern for our city. So then we activated our fire crews, our hazmat team, the oil spill response trailer, and started to do the mitigation efforts at the TIC. Then this is where it gets to me very, very interesting. At 2:45, the city was notified by the Newport Beach Rescue Vessel that there were private contractors conducting oil spill cleanups outside of the air show flight box.
So Huntington Beach officials were being told not to worry, that the oil won't make it to the sand for another few days. But meanwhile, the company has people actively cleaning up oil just outside the borders of Huntington's event. The company certainly knew how close the oil was, but they didn't communicate that to the Huntington Beach officials. And I would really love to know why the hell the Coast Guard was telling officials that they didn't have to worry yet about the oil for 2 more days. But the city of Huntington Beach, they didn't wait to find out what the truth was. Thank God. Based on the reports that they were getting from the locals, at 4 p.m., they decided to lay booms at the wetlands, and booms kind of float on the water and prevent the oil from coming in. And there are a lot of wetlands in Huntington Beach. So here is Dr. David Valentine. He is an earth science professor of marine science at UC Santa Barbara, and here he is testifying to Congress on October 18th.
In Orange County, the areas that I would look at most closely as being especially vulnerable on the environmental side would be the wetland environments, places like Talbot Marsh, where oil can surge in with the tide, and it can get trapped in those environments, and it can get stuck, and it won't come back out when the tide recedes. Those are especially vulnerable because they're these rich, diverse ecosystems. They provide a whole host of different services, whether it's flyways or fisheries, or in keeping the nutrient levels moderated on the coastal waters. And that oil can stick there, and it can have a long-term impact. And furthermore, cleanup in those cases can be very difficult because getting into a marsh and trying to clean it up manually can cause as much damage as the oil can cause.
And so it was really good that they decided to protect the wetlands when they did. 45 minutes after they decided to protect the wetlands at 4:45 p.m. on Saturday, Huntington Beach also decided to close the beaches. And then 45 minutes after that, at 5:30 p.m., oil was visible in Huntington Beach. And by 7 p.m., oil had hit the shore on Huntington Beach. The city also decided by 11 p.m. that night to cancel the air show for the next day. And the thing about the air show is it brings in so much business to downtown Huntington Beach. All of us in Orange County are suckers for the Blue Angels. And so the air show being canceled last year due to COVID and then canceled on Sunday of this year due to fossil fuels, it was a huge economic hit to the city. But it was the right call to make. By midday Sunday, oil was clearly visible in the water surrounding the Huntington Beach Pier, and there were giant pools of thick black oil poisoning the sand. The city of Huntington Beach did an amazing job protecting the public. Their decision to boom the wetlands in particular, while being told not to worry by the Coast Guard, was especially consequential because had they waited just 2 hours and 15 minutes longer, it would have been too late. But the response could have been better. Here's Huntington Beach's Mayor, Kim Carr.
What we could have done better, what could have been an opportunity was perhaps if the Coast Guard had some sort of awareness the night before or to let us know. So when that 9 o'clock notification came through, we could have been even more proactive because as it said before, every hour counts during these crises.
Like I said, I want to know what the hell the Coast Guard officials were thinking when they told Huntington Beach officials that they had days before they had to do anything. They would have been better off saying nothing at all. And you know what? I should mention this because you might be thinking it. Long-term listeners know that my stepbrother is a high-ranking official with the Coast Guard here in Southern California. But since you last heard from him, he retired from the Coast Guard. And so I've lost my insider mole into the Coast Guard right when I needed him the most. But I want Congress to investigate the Coast Guard response. And with Katie Porter in charge of a congressional committee, I'm actually confident that they will. But it wasn't just the Coast Guard that fucked up, obviously. So here's Representative Mike Levin of California's 49th District. And so he represents the South Orange County coast, starting in like Dana Point and going down into La Jolla. Here's what he said on October 18th.
We know that this spill was not reported by the responsible oil company until the next day, despite the company's knowledge. We also know that Orange County residents recognized that there was a problem in part due to the smell caused by the spill and actually reported it before the oil company did so. Clearly something wrong with that.
Which is true. But also, again, on Friday night, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration had spotted the oil spill on their satellite and had told the regulators. And yet, Huntington Beach wasn't notified. So it's not just the company that didn't notify the locals. It was the federal government. We definitely need to put requirements in place for both the private companies and the feds to inform locals in these situations. While the spill response is largely a success story, thanks in large part to the competence of the local elected officials and law enforcement, the communication with locals was a clear failure that can and should be fixed. And I call the response a success story because the Huntington Beach and Newport Beach officials did all they could, but much of this was out of their control. This spill was and still is a disaster for their communities, for my communities. So here is, I don't know how to pronounce this name, but I'm going to go with Vipe Desai. He's the founding member of the Business Alliance for Protecting the Pacific Coast, which is an organization that represents the economic interests of more than 55,000 coastal businesses. Here is his testimony to Congress to the House Committee on Natural Resources on October 18th.
The first impact came from the much-anticipated Pacific Air Show. As oil began to wash ashore, beaches were deemed unsafe for activity. On Saturday, October 2nd, 1.5 million visitors saw the show from Huntington Beach, but the show's triumphant conclusion on Sunday was canceled with little fanfare. Cancellations hit hotels and resorts almost immediately, and their surrounding and retail and restaurants suffered. Wing Lam, co-founder of Wahoo's Fish Tacos, informed me that the Saturday before the oil spill felt like a busy summer day, but the following day, once word got out about the spill, it was a ghost town. In addition, as the spill moved south, their locations in Laguna Beach and San Clemente started to feel the impacts. Bobby Abdel, owner of Jack's Surfboards, had a similarly bleak weekend. He told me that once the oil spill was announced, customer traffic plummeted. Their stores are facing a stockpile of unsold inventory from the U.S. Open of Surfing and the Pacific Air Show. All 9 of Jack's Surfboards locations were impacted in some form or another because of the spill. Later in the week, I received a call from a colleague, Wendy Marshall, a full-time, hardworking mother of 2 who shared with me that her upcoming Airbnb reservations, a form of income to help her offset college tuition costs for her children, had mostly been canceled. From Dana Point, the dolphin and whale capital of the world and the first whale heritage site in the Americas, Giselle Anderson from local business Captain Dave's Dolphin and Whale Watching Safari shared losses from trips and bookings into November could be down as much as 74% because of the oil spill.
The business damage is real in Orange County. And like I said, the fisheries are still closed, and so it's ongoing. And as for the beaches, they reopened after about 8 days in Huntington Beach. But here's the situation when it comes to oil on the sand. Here's Representative Katie Porter, who made these hearings happen. She represents South Orange County, including Irvine, so she represents my mom, also represents Lake Forest, Mission Viejo, and Santa Margarita. But here is what she said in the hearing that she called on October 18th.
As of October 10, workers had recovered 250,000 pounds of oily debris and 14 barrels full of tar balls from the Orange County shorelines. That is a small fraction, though, of the oil that was released, most of which is being distributed in the ocean, making its way into the food chain or falling to the ocean floor. Some of that oil is now heading south. And we will not learn the long-term consequences on the environment for many years to come.
And it's not just Huntington Beach and Newport in the Orange County beaches. This is going further than that. Here's Representative Mike Levin. Again, he represents South Orange County.
In my congressional district, which is just to the south of here, the spill shut down businesses and beaches in Dana Point and San Clemente. Tar balls that are likely caused by the spill have also been found as far south in my district as Oceanside, Carlsbad, Encinitas, and Del Mar in San Diego County.
So this spill is spreading, and we don't know how far it's going to go. And so how did this happen? Well, here's Chuck Bonham. He's the head of the California Department of Fishing and Wildlife. He's been the head of that organization since 2011. And here is what he told the California State Senate on October 28th.
What we now know is about 4.5 miles offshore, so in federal waters, there's a pipeline that runs from one platform, which is a collection of 3 platforms operated by a company called Beta Offshore, owned by a company called Amplify Energy. That last platform, Ellie, has a pipeline which delivers the product 17.7 miles inland, where the pipe comes onshore just below the Queen Mary, more or less, to land-based infrastructure. That pipe had a rupture in it, and we now know, based on visual and diver and other evidentiary efforts, that about 4,000 feet of that pipeline was moved about 105 feet off of center. And in that stretch is about a 13-inch horizontal, almost like a hairline fracture, if you could imagine a brome break, in a pipe, which is, I think, about 13 inches in diameter, concrete on the outside, metal on the inside. That's the likely source of the leak.
Now, the specific theory, as it's being kicked around right now, is that a large container ship dragged its anchor during heavy winds on January 25th. I don't know how they nailed down that date, but they say that on January 25th, the anchor probably hit the undersea pipeline. But they don't know when the oil began leaking. But the way that they know that it was so long ago is that underwater pictures were taken of the ruptured pipeline and showed that marine life had grown on the pipe. And so that couldn't have happened if the metal had been exposed to the water just 6 weeks ago when the leak began. But if the pipeline was hit 9 months before the spill, it's insane to me that workers didn't have any way to know and therefore notice that 4,000 feet of that pipeline, about 3/4 of a mile, had moved. You want to know what might have helped that situation? Cameras! Why the hell don't we require cameras? But anyway, the leak happened sometime between Biden's inauguration week and October 1st. And right now, that's all we know. But there is one bit of good news that we do know that is confirmed that I think everyone who loves the Pacific Ocean will be relieved to hear. Here's Chuck Bonham again, the head of the California Department of Fishing and Wildlife.
From the very beginning moments, all of us involved assumed a worst case. At that moment in time, we had a planning number of a spill of about 3,134 barrels, which is 131,000 gallons, rounding, as a maximum worst case. A month later, we now think the likely spill number is 24,696 gallons.
And that's less than 20% of what we thought was spilled when we first found out about it on October 2nd. It could have been so much worse. This wasn't the spill that I've feared my entire life since seeing those oil rigs off the coast of Huntington Beach. You know, some people look out there at night with all the lights and stuff and say that they're beautiful. I think they're a tragedy waiting to happen. And this is a tragedy, but it's not the big one. And there were other ways that luck was on our side 6 weeks ago. Here's Chuck Bonham again.
Fortunately, given the size of the spill, there were not as many wildlife casualties as could have occurred during a higher migration cycle.
And right now, when it comes to the wetlands, well, there's good news and there's bad news. Here's Kim Carr, the mayor of Huntington Beach.
The Bolsa Chica Ecological Reserve was spared. The Talbot Marsh does have oil damage. And again, looking back, if we could have had maybe a few more hours notice, we probably could have mitigated that damage even more than what we did.
And I've seen some pictures of Talbot Marsh, and it's not good. But the fact that they were able to keep all of the oil out of Bolsa Chica wetlands, especially knowing that they were not given accurate information and boomed the wetlands when they did as a precaution, I'm so grateful for the officials in Huntington Beach that they did that. They really served the community well. This is an example of what government can do. Government isn't bad by its nature. Like, effective government can do really good things. And this is a beautiful example of that. But like I said before, when it comes to this particular spill, this is just the beginning. Here's what the experts are worried about from here. Here's Dr. David Valentine. Again, he's an earth science professor of marine science at UC Santa Barbara. And this is his testimony from October 18th.
And then the other environment that I worry a lot about is the environment we can't see. That is what's going on under the surface of the ocean. In that case, we can have oil that comes ashore and then gets pulled back offshore, but is now denser because it's accumulated sand and other mineral matter, and that can be sticking around in the coastal ocean. We don't really understand how much of that there is or exactly where it goes, and that concerns me.
And the concerns extend far beyond the OC. So here's Pete Stauffer. He is the environmental director for the Surfrider Foundation, which is a community of people who work to protect the ocean and all of the lives that depend on it. Here's his testimony to the California State Senate on October 28th.
Now, with oil deposits seen as far south as the Mexico border, there are concerns that San Diego wetlands are also being impacted. Moreover, while birds, fish, and marine mammals have been the most visibly impacted, the full scale of the ecological damage will take some time to become clear. In the weeks since the spill event, the oil slick has transformed into an incalculable number of tar balls in the ocean. While tar balls typically float, they can also find their way into underwater sediment or nearshore habitats where their impacts on ecological health and wildlife may persist for years or even decades.
But even with this expansion of the oil spill, making it all the way down to Mexico, when you really look at it, luck was on our side in this respect too. Because the day of the spill, when I found out, I researched the ocean currents, and the big currents actually move north. And so that's why in my mental breakdown on Instagram, for those of you that saw it, that's why I was worried that the spill would be affecting the LA beaches in the days and weeks after it happened. But that's not the direction the oil ended up going. It went south. And of course, that sucks for Newport, San Diego, and Mexico. But here's Vipe Desai. Again, he's the founding member of the Business Alliance for Protecting the Pacific Coast.
Had this oil spill moved north, it would have impacted two of the busiest ports in the nation, which account for billions of dollars of goods flowing in and out of both ports of LA and Long Beach. And that would have had an even larger impact to other communities across the U.S.
You think the approximately 100 cargo ships that are waiting off our shores to be unloaded is bad now? You think the supply shortage is bad now? Can you imagine if the port had to be shut down due to an oil spill 6 weeks ago? It could have been so much worse, and it could have affected you no matter where you live in this country. Now, that didn't happen. But again, this story is just beginning. Here's Brian Nowicki. He is the California Climate Policy Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. This is his testimony from October 28th to the California State Senate.
What I can say, though, for sure, is that it is going to take longer than one season to see what the full impacts are to the local wildlife. And of course, it is wetlands and marshes that often are the most difficult and take the longest to recover from these sorts of impacts.
And so in the future, let's hope our relatively good luck continues. And let's take a look at what we can do to make luck less necessary in the future. So as far as California is concerned, the citizens of California and our elected representatives here in the state have been crystal clear in communicating what we want to do, because California banned new offshore drilling decades ago. But platforms such as Ellie, the one that connected via leaky pipeline to Long Beach, well, they continue to operate in federal waters. So our state loses governing authority over our oceans past 3 miles off our coast. Which means that the federal government, the one with laws written by Congress, they're the offshore drilling police responsible for the rigs and pipelines that leaked here last month. And the feds knew that the company, Beta Offshore, and their parent company, Amplify Energy of Texas, were irresponsible companies. The Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, the BSEE, which is responsible for reviewing drilling permits, inspecting offshore drilling rigs, and writing regulations and standards for offshore drilling, they found 71 non-compliance incidents that required a part of Amplify Energy's facility to be shut down at least temporarily. And there was one incident that was serious enough to require the entire facility to be temporarily shut down. Despite this, Amplify Energy was planning to drill new wells near the site of the leak by the end of this year. And get this, this is Representative Katie Porter of Irvine on October 18th.
So recently I asked the Department of Interior about the specific kinds of subsidies that Beta Operating received. Beta is a subsidiary of Amplify Energy, and that's the company that owns the platforms and the pipelines that leaked off our coast. It turns out that they got nearly $20 million from the federal government specifically because the oil wells are at the end of their lives and are not producing much oil, which makes them less profitable. So taxpayers are being asked to pay to encourage oil production in the Pacific Ocean by giving oil companies millions of dollars to do it.
And she added,
Beta Operating is in line to get another $11 million to drill 4 new wells off the coast, because that $11 million is needed, in their words, to make production economic. So taxpayers are being asked to pay Beta to drill new wells. That means wells that would otherwise not be drilled without our taxpayer subsidy.
and as I hear this, I can't help but think of the infrastructure bill that was just signed into law, because it authorizes $6 billion to keep old nuclear power plants running, even if the operators don't want to keep them because they're unprofitable. And now we find out that our federal taxes are being used to keep the oil rigs that are threatening and spoiling our coasts in operation, despite them not being profitable either. You know, free market orthodoxy, which is the economic religion that all of us in the world trade system are supposed to adhere to, that says that the market will decide when products are no longer wanted and eliminate them naturally. Well, that's what's happening here. Offshore drilling is economically not working out, and so it should be winding down if this free market economy were actually a thing. But instead, our taxes are prolonging the fossil fuel industry's existence, keeping it around despite the market deciding that other energy sources are the preference of the customers. The reality of our economy is that it's clearly not free market despite all of the sloganeering. It's a rigged market, rigged over decades, and in this case, by lawmakers paid off by those who make money by selling fossil fuels. Economically, allowing offshore drilling to continue clearly doesn't make sense if our taxes are needed to make it work. And it's not like offshore drilling is making the world a better place like other things that our taxes are used to facilitate, like education or firefighting or social workers or healthcare, which are all things that every citizen needs on standby. In this case, citizens are voting to stop the drilling in our oceans, with the latest example being the Huntington Beach City Council, which voted a few weeks ago to say that they want a full ban on offshore drilling off of our coast. Not a ban on new drilling, which has been California's statewide policy since I was born. They want a ban on all drilling. This is why this is a story that needs to be told to the entire country, because California has spoken. We do not want drilling off of our shores. But the federal government, the rest of this country, via laws enacted in Congress, the rest of this country is putting our coasts at risk. This was a federal spill. And there have been a lot of federal spills. Here's Vipe Desai of the Business Alliance for Protecting the Pacific Coast.
In fact, between 2007 and 2018, there were over 7,000 oil spills in federal waters, an average of about 2 every day.
And a lot of those spills have been big spills. Here's Pete Stauffer, the environmental director for the Surfrider Foundation.
According to the federal government, there have been at least 44 oil spills since 1969 that have each released more than 10,000 barrels of oil into U.S. waters.
And while the focus today is on oil spills in the offshore area, onshore spills are an enormous problem too. Here's Brian Nowicki, the California Climate Policy Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. He's testifying on October 28th to the California State Senate.
But I want to be clear that this is not a problem unique to offshore platforms. At the exact same time that tens of thousands of gallons of oil were rolling up onto beaches and marshes in Orange County, there was an oil spill in Kern County that is now approaching 5 million gallons of fluid, a mixture of crude oil, toxic wastewater that includes 600,000 gallons of crude. In fact, in just the last few years, there have been many oil spills in California greater than the spill off Huntington Beach. In the Simrick field alone, there were 3 huge spills in 2019 at 550,000 gallons, 836,000, and 1.2 million gallons, respectively. 159,000 in Midway in 2019, 250,000 at McKittrick in 2020. There is another ongoing spill at a separator plant in Cimric that has been leaking since 2003 and has reportedly released as much as 84 million gallons of fluid to date. Now, these numbers reflect total combined volumes of crude and produced water and mud, which constitute toxic mix. And as state agencies have testified before this legislature in the past, these dangerous onshore oil operations have contaminated groundwater, land, and wildlife.
But we'll have to look into those onshore spills another day, because I'm sure there will be another on-land fossil fuel disaster soon enough to warrant an episode about it. But when it comes to offshore drilling, the worst spills, if we continue to do this, are probably ahead of us. They're probably in our future. And here's why. Here's Brian Nowicki, the California Climate Policy Director at the Center for Biological Diversity.
After more than 150 years of the oil industry drilling at will in California, the easy oil is gone, and the bottom of the barrel that's left is harder and more dangerous to extract. It is also some of the most carbon-polluting crude in the world. With the easy stuff taken, the oil industry is in decline in California, with production down 68% since 1985. The only question is how much more damage will this dying industry do on its way out?
And so with all that easy to get oil, like the oil that's off the coast of California and in the shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico, with that oil running out, the fossil fuel profiteers are having to go further and further out into the ocean and drill deeper and deeper until they can get to what is left. Here's Dr. Donald Bosch. He is a high-ranking, fancy-ass professor at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science.
Oil and gas production from wells in less than 1,000 feet of water declined as fields discovered in the 80s and even earlier were depleted. Crude oil production in these relatively shallow waters declined by over 90%, both in the Gulf and off Southern California. Natural gas production in the OCS, which mainly came from these shallow water wells, declined by 80%. Offshore fossil energy production is now dominated in the deep water of the Gulf of Mexico, up to 7,500 feet deep. Deep water production grew by 38% just over the last 10 years since the Deepwater Horizon disaster.
And so offshore drilling, despite Deepwater Horizon, is just getting more and more prevalent and deeper into the ocean. And I do just want to take a minute to note how that happened, because I'm still mad about it. There was a treaty signed in our names by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. It was a deal with Mexico that said that they were going to drill deeper in the Gulf than where the Deepwater Horizon disaster was. Just 2 years after the disaster is when she signed this. And this was never debated in our Congress. Instead, it was attached to a government funding bill, like the one that we have coming up, maybe on December 3rd, probably closer to Christmas. But when they fund the entire government with one bill, which is not the proper process, but they can sneak all kind of shit into law. Well, that's how it got authorized to drill even deeper in the Gulf of Mexico than where the Deepwater Horizon spill was. It was the Democrats that did that. It was the Democrats that signed that deal. And it was a bipartisan consensus to sneak that into law with no debate and no knowledge passed on to the public about what they were doing. That's how that happened. Just FYI, just a little blast from the past. But anyway, what that means is that the spills are more and more likely to be Deepwater Horizon level serious as the fossil fuel industry's desperation for their product accelerates deeper into the Gulf of Mexico. And so who's policing all of this risky business? Well, after the Deepwater Horizon disaster in May of 2010, the Department of Interior reorganized the Minerals Management Service, which were essentially the offshore drilling police who were caught eating donuts and watching porn on their phones instead of doing their jobs. And so now, instead of them in charge, we have two divisions of offshore drilling police. One is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the BOEM, which is responsible for leasing and resource management. And the other is the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, BSEE, which is responsible for reviewing drilling permits, inspecting the offshore rigs, and writing the regulations and standards for offshore drilling. Now, before COVID, Congress had asked the Government Accountability Office to review the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement's management of those offshore oil and gas pipelines. And they looked specifically at pipelines that were no longer being used, pipelines that have been what they call decommissioned. When oil rigs and platforms and the pipelines that connect to them are decommissioned, most of the time, all of that infrastructure is being left in the ocean. They aren't removing it. They aren't cleaning up their messes. And there is a reason behind that is good for the ocean. So here's Dr. Greg Stuntz. He is a professor of marine biology at Texas A&M University. And here he is testifying to Congress on October 14th.
In fact, these decades-old structures hold tremendous amounts of fish biomass and are major economic drivers. A central question is, how do these structures perform in relation to Mother Nature or natural habitat? And I'm pleased to report that in every parameter we use to measure that success, these artificial reefs produce at least as well or often better than the natural habitat. We observe higher densities of fish, faster growth, and even similar output. Thus, by all measures, these data show artificial reefs are functioning at least equivalent on a per capita basis to enhance our marine resources.
And in fact, the oil drilling platform that the damaged pipeline connects to off the coast of Huntington Beach, Platform Ellie, it's known around here, or I'm not in Orange County right now, but it's known around Orange County by local scuba divers as one of the best places to dive because of all the fish and other sea creatures that have made the underwater portion of that platform their home. And so there is a reasonable argument to be made for keeping oil and gas drilling infrastructure in the ocean for the sake of wildlife sometimes. But it has to be done correctly, and someone has to make sure that that's happening. The infrastructure has to be clean before it's left to rot with the fishies. And here's the risk we run with these pipelines that have been decommissioned but have remained in the ocean. Here's Dr. Donald Bosch again. Again, he is the professor at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. He's testifying to Congress on October 14th.
Hurricane Ida, there was all of a sudden appeared an oil slick, and it lasted for several days. And apparently it was traced to an abandoned pipeline that had not been fully cleared of all the residual oil in it. So all that oil leaked out during that incident.
There's all kinds of things that can cause movement on the ocean floor. Natural events such as hurricanes and mudslides and geologic activity like volcanoes and there can be shifting sands just because of the tides. Like all these things can move pipelines that are both active and decommissioned. And like we said before, there was no cameras down there, so we don't know when they're moving. In fact, there was a pipeline segment that was found 4,000 feet from its original location after it was displaced in Hurricane Katrina. Like this happens, and it happened here off Huntington Beach. Again, they think that the pipeline was hit by the anchor in January. The leak happened in October, and no one knew in the meantime. And another point that I want to bring up is I am currently talking to you from the LA beaches. I'm still at my amazing beach house, really close to the LAX airport. And we're going to do a little story break right here because about a week ago, I went out because I noticed out the window that the pelicans were going nuts. And there were like hundreds of them all diving in the same spot. And pelicans are cool if you've never really seen one hunt for fish because they dive bomb out of the sky. And that's how they catch the fish. And so when you see a bunch of pelicans doing that, it's awesome, right? And I looked a little closer and it wasn't just pelicans. There were dolphins out there too. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go out for a run and just check out the scene out there. So I went for my run and at one point, I look over and I notice there are dolphins super close to the shore and they're playing in the waves. They were like surfing. It was so cool. And so like a child, I veered off the bike path and ran full speed towards the water to see how close I could get to the dolphins. It was awesome. Like I did get pretty close to the dolphins. They were in the waves and then the pelicans behind them. Like it was a beautiful, magical thing. And I was out there for like at least 45 minutes just watching the wonder of nature in the ocean, so cheesy, but yeah, it was awesome. And so since my run was obviously over, I decided to walk back along the sand because on a day like that, you just never know when a dolphin's going to pop out of the water. And so I start walking back along the shore. And that's when I looked down and just noticed that there was oil everywhere. And it's these things that they keep calling tar balls. Now, they're not balls. They're not round. They're always, I think it's more accurate to call them tar patties, because they're all kinds of different shapes, and it's basically oil mixed with sand, and they're all over the beach. And some of you may have seen this on my Instagram, but they were huge to the point that I picked one up and it was the size of my entire hand. And when you move these things around, they very quickly turn right back into gooey old oil. And so I ended up with oil all over my hand. And the only way to get that shit off is a pro tip for you: use olive oil. And so I had to go home and I use olive oil, and then I use a dry paper towel to like scratch it off. But like, that's what I had to do that day. But the oil was everywhere. And I'll make sure that when I release this episode that we put something on Instagram showing you my pictures from that day, because it was crazy. And then I looked and there was just oil. You could see it. It was all up and down the beach. The sand was black. And I really don't know how I missed that to begin with. I must have ran right through it, but I was so, dolphin that I just didn't notice. So then flash forward to the next day, and we were expecting really, really high tides. And it's really flat here. And so every time that happens, we get bulldozers that go out to the sand, and they create these big dunes to protect the houses from these really high tides. And so they did that. And what I noticed is that there were a bunch of families out there with their kids sledding down the dunes. Now, in California, where we don't have snow, this is it's like a fun thing to do. And these particular dunes were really fun to sled on, I'm sure, because they were slick with oil. So these people were flying. But there were like little babies climbing up these dunes, and the oil, you could just see it just slicked right through the sand. I don't understand how these parents didn't notice. And there were just too many of them. I wasn't going to be that Cassandra being like, get your damn kids out of the oil. But what I'm standing here wondering is like, who's cleaning up this oil? Because this oil is stuff that's just washing up. There's no one here checking to see if it has to do with the Orange County spill. And I don't think it does. I checked out the Heal the Bay website to see what's up. Now, they call it natural. They say that these are natural oil deposits that are coming up because this entire coastline used to just be covered in oil derricks in the 1930s. And they were everywhere. And so I think we have this legacy oil that just keeps washing up on the shores here. And this is definitely known as an oily beach. As a volleyball player going to college here, I definitely had to scrape oil off of my feet more than once. But I have never seen anything like this. Never seen anything like this. And you want to know how many people I saw out there cleaning it up? Zero. There were zero. In situations like this, where the oil is coming from places that we can't identify, when it's not part of a giant spill, or if it's something from a decommissioned pipeline, there is no oil spill response. There is no company that's responsible for that. If anyone picks it up, it's going to be taxpayer funded because there's no connection. And so I don't know where that oil came from, but there was a shitload of it. And I was just out there on the beach. It's a week later. It's still out there. No one's picking it up. So yeah, these decommissioned pipelines and all of this underwater infrastructure that's been left there from the oil and gas industry, it's still polluting. And the thing is, there's a lot more infrastructure that's soon to be decommissioned. Here's Dr. Donald Bosch again. Again, he's the professor at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science.
Off Southern California, there are 23 platforms in federal waters, 8 of which are soon facing decommissioning. In the Gulf, on the other hand, there are 1,862 platforms, and about 1,000 of them will probably be decommissioned within this decade.
And so to find out what happens to that infrastructure, specifically the pipelines, because again, this was a leak from a pipeline, the GAO was asked by Congress to conduct this review. And so during COVID, GAO did that, and their report was released in March. And the results were not good. So here's a quote. The report said, quote, BSEE does not have a robust process to address the safety and environmental risks posed by leaving decommissioned pipelines in place on the seafloor due to the cumulative effects of oversight gaps before, during, and after the decommissioning process, unquote. Uh-oh. So let's start with the before process. The report says, quote, BSEE does not thoroughly account for safety and environmental risks during its review of applications to decommission, contributing to the Bureau authorizing over 97%, almost 18,000 miles of pipeline to be left on the seafloor, unquote. To get more into the details on that and their application process, The report says that these fossil fuel companies aren't told to assess the environmental impacts of their pipelines staying in the ocean, but they are told that they have to assess the environmental impacts of removing them. And so basically that skews the results in favor of always keeping the pipelines on the ocean floor. And with a 97% approval rate, it kind of makes sense. These pieces fit together. Because if you have a pro and con list of keeping pipelines in the ocean, but only the pros are required to be on the list, that list is of course going to skew towards the pros, towards keeping the pipelines in the water. Then the BSEE itself, when reviewing the applications, doesn't bother to fully consider whether abandoned pipelines pose risks to ship navigation and fishing operations. And let's keep in mind that the Huntington Beach spill was likely caused when a pipeline was hit by a ship's anchor. The BSEE also doesn't fully consider if the abandoned pipeline would interfere with other uses of that part of the outer continental shelf, like wind power generation, for example, or if it would cause other negative environmental effects. And that's important because the BSEE is required to make sure that decommissioned pipelines don't interfere with other uses for that part of the ocean. And real-world evidence exists that they are failing to consider that because from 2015 through 2019, 89 ships were damaged as a result of snagging their equipment on oil and gas infrastructure. And the report says that most of those snags are believed to be from underwater pipelines. There's only one area of review that the BSEE does seem to be considering, and that's whether the pipelines would interfere with what they call areas of significant sediment resources. In normie language, these are areas with like lots of sand under the water. And that's sand that local communities can dig up to replenish their beaches when erosion wipes their sand away. This happens all the time in Waikiki Beach, where I used to live. The water at high tide now in Waikiki goes right up to the hotel patios. In fact, Joe and I really liked to watch it when it happened because we were aware of the tides. And so what Joe and I like to do is we had these amazing little floaties that had a cup holder on one side and a cooler for 6 packs of beer on the other side. And so instead of going to the beach and hanging out with all the tourists, we would just float out and just hang out in the ocean. And we would just sit there and watch as wave after wave would get closer and closer to the hotels and just drive all these tourists away from the beach. And we would watch, the ones that are napping, they'd get wiped out with water and, oh, my sandal disappeared. It was really fun, actually. But in the process of that, the beach keeps disappearing. And as the sea level rises, this is actually a really big problem because, Waikiki is responsible for a giant part of Hawaii's economy. And, I know that once upon a time, Waikiki was replenished with sand that they shipped in from Manhattan Beach here in Los Angeles. Because every beach volleyball player who's ever played there knows that beach's sand is perfect and deep and plentiful. Playing volleyball there is a real calf workout. But more recently, Waikiki has been replenished with sand right off of their shore. So basically what they do is they dig up the sand that disappeared from the beach and landed on the ocean floor, and they put it back. And if you think about that dynamic, you can't do that if there's a pipeline in the middle of those underwater sand locations. Now, the BSEE is considering that when pipelines are to be left on the seafloor off of California and in the Gulf of Mexico. But the concerning thing is that they are considering it and letting the oil companies leave the pipelines there anyway. Since the 1970s, BSEE has allowed over 3,600 miles of pipelines to be left to rot in areas that could or would be dredged for sand if they weren't there. And so big picture, the report says that 80% of known areas of sand buildup can't be used for restoring beaches due to the existing network of all offshore oil and gas infrastructure, including pipelines, both functioning pipelines and the ones that have been left to rot. So the approval process is definitely flawed and skews in every way towards letting the oil companies avoid paying to remove their infrastructure from the ocean when they're done with it. Then, after that approval process, if you can even call it that, occurs, during their decommissioning process, the report says, quote, BSEE does not ensure that operators meet decommissioning standards such as cleaning and burying pipelines, unquote. Now, this seems common sense to me. But the problem is that pipelines corrode over time in seawater. And if they aren't properly cleaned, these pipelines can and eventually will release whatever toxic goop is left inside of them. And BSEE, it turns out, has been issuing all kinds of waivers allowing the fossil fuel companies to essentially skip the required cleaning process. The report doesn't, however, offer any reasons for why they're doing that. But the thing that we need to know is that since 2019, so, during the second half of the Trump administration when foxes were running the government hen houses, well, in the second half of the Trump years, BSEE approved over 82% of applications, so 23 out of 28 requests to skip cleaning fossil fuel pipelines that were going to be left in the sea. So that's the decommissioning process. And then, after the decommissioning is complete, whether the pipeline has been cleaned or not, the report says that, quote, BSEE does not monitor the condition and location of pipelines following their decommissioning in place, which reduces its ability to mitigate any long-term risks, such as pipeline exposure or movement, unquote. So to be more specific, after the decommissioning is complete, BSEE has no processes currently in place to observe the pipeline activities while they're underway. BSEE also doesn't conduct inspections after these pipelines are decommissioned. Instead, BSEE lets fossil fuel companies self-report that they completed the decommissioning checklist. But if they don't check, they're just taking the fossil fuel company's word for it. And then after the fact, if something is discovered to have gone wrong after the decommissioning is done, if a pipeline that's supposed to be buried, for example, becomes unburied, BSEE contacts the previous owner of the pipeline and asks them for a plan to fix it. But if they can't find that previous owner, or if it, for example, went bankrupt and doesn't officially exist anymore, then it's our taxes that pay for the pipeline removal. And this is possible because, as the report concluded, quote, if pipelines decommissioned in place are later found to pose risks, there is no funding source for removal, unquote. So, for example, about 130 miles of abandoned pipelines have no existing previous operator and are located on areas that local communities would like to use to restore their beaches. But because there is no owner on paper, at least anymore, if we as a society want to access those areas, we're going to have to pay to clean up the fossil fuel industry's mess because there is no fund filled with their money set aside to do this. And the report says that this problem is almost guaranteed to get much, much bigger for us taxpayers because that 130 miles of abandoned pipeline that's already been ordered to be removed is just a small fraction of the over 3,600 miles of pipelines that BSEE approved to be abandoned in similar areas with lots of underwater sand. And we do have a cost estimate, but it's super outdated and definitely much more than this. But in 2004, 17 years ago, it was estimated that it would cost $21.5 billion in today's dollars to remove all of the existing pipelines. Now, back then, most of the pipelines were in shallow water when they did this assessment, which made those relatively easy projects for removing the pipeline. And that doesn't account for the approximately 8,500 miles of pipeline that's been installed since that 2004 study, the majority of which was installed in deep water and therefore is far more expensive and difficult to remove. And so that $21.5 billion, that has to be just a fraction of the actual cost. And I want to take a few minutes here to focus on that price tag in the many tens of billions that's likely to be ours to pay with our taxes if the laws don't change. So here's Dr. Donald Bosch again. Again, he's the professor at University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. He's testifying to Congress on October 14th.
So the depletion of shallow water gas has left this legacy of old wells and declining resources and the infrastructure. This requires decommissioning and removal. Much of this infrastructure is not operated by the original leaseholders, but by smaller companies with lesser assets and technical and operational capacity.
And here's how that works. So here's Robert Schwerk. He is the executive director of the North America office at the Carbon Tracker Initiative. That's a financial think tank that does have the goal of a transition away from using fossil fuels for energy. They are upfront and proud of their bias. And they study and advise those in the corporate world, at least those in the corporate world that think climate change is real and that a transition to clean energy is actually happening. Well, this think tank studies specifically risks and opportunities in the global energy markets. Here he is speaking to Representative Katie Porter in the October 14th hearing.
Typically, what we'll see is well-to-do companies will transfer these assets into other entities that have less financial means and wherewithal to actually conduct the cleanup.
So they're moving, once they've taken the money and they've made the profit, then they're basically transferring away the unprofitable, difficult, expensive part of this, which is the decommissioning portion. And they're transferring that. Are they transferring that to big, healthy companies?
No, often they're transferring it to companies that didn't exist even prior to the transfer. So
you mean a shell company?
Yes.
Like an entity created just for the purpose of pushing off the cost of doing business so that you don't have to pay it even though you got all the upside? Are you saying that this is what oil and gas companies do?
We've seen this, yes.
And how does the law facilitate this?
How does it facilitate it? Well, I suppose on a couple of levels. On the one hand, there's very little oversight of the transfer. And so there's very little restriction from a regulatory standpoint. This is true offshore and also onshore. So we see this behavior in both places. And then secondary to that, there is actions that companies can take in bankruptcy that can effectively pass these liabilities on to taxpayers eventually. And so some of it is to be able to use that in the event the new company goes bankrupt.
And here's some real world examples of how this has played out with oil and gas infrastructure off the California coast already. Here's Dr. David Valentine. He's an earth science professor of marine science at UC Santa Barbara. And this testimony was given to Congress on October 18th.
But Dr. Valentine, how concerned do you think Californians should be that companies that own the offshore platforms, wells, and pipelines might go bankrupt and pass decommissioning costs on to taxpayers?
I think that we need to be very concerned. And this is not just a hypothetical. This is already happening. There are two instances that I can tell you about that I've been involved with personally. The first stems from the Pipeline 901 rupture, also known as the Refugio Beach oil spill that happened in 2015. When that pipeline ruptured, it prevented oil from being further produced from Platform Holly off the coast of Santa Barbara, just a few miles from my home. That platform, when it was completely shut in, all 30 wells, was unable to produce any oil, and the company, a small operator, went bankrupt, and then shortly thereafter they went bankrupt again, and this time they just gave up. And they did something called quit claiming their lease back to the state of California, meaning that the plug and abandonment and property commissioning fell into the lap of the state of California in that case. And that is an ongoing saga. The second example I would give you is in Summerland. In 1896, the first offshore oil wells in this country were drilled from piers in Summerland. Those have been leaking over the years. And as recently as last year, there were 3 leaky oil wells coming up in Summerland. The state of California has found money to try alternative plug and abandonment strategies because anything traditional is not going to work on something that is 125 some odd years old. So that would be the second example where this is now falling into the taxpayer's lap yet again.
So that's the situation with abandoned pipelines and wells that are rotting in the sea. But the thing is that we actually have a lot of technically active oil and gas infrastructure that isn't being used, but is also rotting in the sea. So here's Robert Schwerk again. Again, he is the executive director of the North America Office of the Carbon Tracker Initiative, and here is his testimony on October 14th.
Only about a third of the unplugged wells in the Gulf of Mexico have shown any production in the last 12 months. Why haven't the other 2/3 already been retired? Because of uncertainty as to when to close and poor incentives. Infrastructure should be decommissioned when it's no longer useful. But the regulator has difficulty making that determination. This uncertainty explains why Bessie waits 5 years after a well becomes inactive to deem it no longer useful for operations, with years more allowed for decommissioning. These delays increase the risk that operators will become unable to pay or simply disappear. We've seen this already with a variety of companies, including Amplify Energy's predecessor, Beta, Vinoco off California, and Fielded recently in the Gulf of Mexico.
So I'm not entirely sure what he said there at the end, except he was talking about Amplify Energy. And that is the company that owns the platform and the pipeline that leaked off of Orange County's coast. Now, big picture, what we're seeing here is that as U.S. oil production has declined over the decades, larger energy companies have basically shifted their attention to deep water drilling, where most of the existing reserves that we know of and the profits remain untapped. And so the big firms have sold off their aging shallow water platforms and pipelines to smaller players. That's what happened here off the California coast. And those smaller companies have struggled as the price of oil dropped. And they also just don't have the resources that the Shells and the Exxons do to stay on top of safety. And so they're just not able to have the resources on standby to respond quickly and effectively to their spills. Although I guess it is worth mentioning that BP, British Petroleum, is a multinational with those resources, and they sure fucked up the Deepwater Horizon response. So, maybe just having those resources, I don't know if it's impossible, but it doesn't seem to be prioritized by any oil and gas company, at least not that I know of. Well, Amplify Energy itself is a small independent company with only 200 employees. And that's a company that arose from bankruptcy. It's a perfect example of everything that these witnesses are talking about. Its corporate parent company declared bankruptcy 4 years ago, making $1.3 billion of debt disappear. Although that debt didn't disappear, did it? That just means that $1.3 billion in bills and money owed to those hurt by the parent company, those bills just aren't getting paid. So someone always pays, but when they declare bankruptcy like this, it's just not the fossil fuel companies anymore. And after they did that, the new company emerged as Amplify Energy, but it emerged smaller and with little cash on hand. And with the money that they had, like most corporations do, an LA Times review of years' worth of Amplify Energy's financials showed that the company's executives have long emphasized slashing their costs, rebuying their stock, which increases executive pay because executives are often paid in stock, and paying millions of dollars in dividends to shareholders over maintaining a substantial cash reserve and saving for a spilly day. And now that their infrastructure has spilled oil all over the Southern California coast, Amplify has said that it can't promise that its insurance can cover all of its liabilities for this spill. And that's because the federal government hasn't required them to make sure that they can pay to clean up all their messes. And that doesn't just include oil spills. Going back to decommissioning, because they were required to have some money set aside for oil spills. But when it comes to decommissioning, there's not nearly enough money set aside to make sure that they can remove all their trash when they've sucked all of the oil out of the ground under the ocean and can't suck anymore. Here's Robert Shirk of the Carbon Tracker Initiative again.
The issue is just really giving them a financial incentive to be able to decommission, and that means they have to confront the cost of decommissioning and internalize that into their decision on whether continuing to produce from a well is economic or not. And so that means they need to have some kind of financial insurance in place that represents the actual cost. That could be a surety bond where they go to an insurer that acts as a guarantor for that amount. It could be a sinking fund like we have in the context of nuclear, where they go start putting money aside at the beginning and it grows over time to be sufficient to plug the well at the end of its useful life. And there could be other forms of restricted cash that they maintain on the balance sheet for the benefit of these liabilities.
And so here's his suggested solution to all of this.
The solution is simple. Require financial assurance equivalent to the full cost of carrying out all decommissioning obligations. This could take the form of a surety bond, a sinking fund, or some other form of restricted cash equivalent. If wells are still economic to operate, considering the carrying cost of financial assurance, the operator will continue production. If not, they'll plug. In either case, the public is protected from these costs.
Which makes a lot of sense to me. But get this, even when bonds are already required in law, the offshore drilling police, here's Jacqueline Savitz, the Chief Policy Officer at Oceana.
Supplemental bonds are necessary to protect taxpayers from the risk of spills, but BOEM is overusing the waiver provisions that allow a financial strength test to waive requirements for supplemental bonds. BOEM regulations require that lessees furnish a relatively small general bond, and while BOEM has discretion to acquire supplemental bonds, they generally waive those. General bonds that lessees are required to furnish don't come close to covering the cost of decommissioning and haven't been updated since 1993. Since that year, the cost of decommissioning has gone up, in part because development has moved into deeper waters. Only about 10% of offshore oil production in the Gulf was in deep water in 1993. But by 2014, that figure rose to 80%. Regulations need to be updated to ensure the federal government and taxpayers are not left picking up the tab on decommissioning. According to GAO, only 8% of decommissioning liabilities in the Gulf of Mexico were covered by bonds or other financial assurance mechanisms, with the other 92% waived or simply unaccounted for.
So regulators are clearly far too friendly to this industry, and this isn't a new problem. We have laws, but administration after administration are waiving them. And the regulations at the federal level being written to protect our local coastlines are not as strict as the ones we locals want governing our coastlines. So here's Jennifer Lucchesi. She is a California State Lands Commissioner. The commission manages 4 million acres of waters in the state of California. And here she is on October 28th testifying to the California State Senate.
For pipelines that are solely within state waters and under lease with the State Lands Commission, we require the pipelines to be externally and internally inspected annually. For those pipelines that cross both federal and state waters, our authority is more limited because the federal government's regulatory authority takes precedence. And PHMSA is a primary federal agency that regulates those interstate pipelines. They require inspections externally and internally every 2 years. And that's what this pipeline at issue was subjected to. So the Platform LE pipeline.
The pipeline that leaked off of Orange County was last inspected in October of 2020 and therefore wouldn't be inspected again until the end of 2022. But California, based on the regulations that we've written for our own state, we want the inspections to be done every year. But because the federal government trumps the states, the infrastructure that threatens our air, our water, our beaches, our cities, our businesses, they're not being protected to the extent that we have voted for. Because 3 miles off the coast is considered federal territory, and we, as a country, are doing a job of electing people who can and want to govern effectively for the people. We have a federal government that prioritizes business and shareholders above everything, and the results of that are washing up all over our coastlines right now. And with that in mind, I do need, just real quick before we wrap this up, I do need to do what I hate and get into politics here for a second. Because every representative in Congress that you've heard speak and ask questions today has been a Democrat. But there were Republicans in these hearings too. And you know that I want to make informative, substantive episodes. I don't like to air nonsense, but I think I'm doing you a disservice if I don't let you hear some of the Republican members in these hearings for yourself. Because when we look at our Congress and our federal government and its rampant, unapologetic corporatism, you know, our weak laws and the way taxpayers are getting financially screwed in favor of the fossil fuel industry and the offshore drilling policing that isn't happening. All of this is connected. And the members of the Republican Party, I just want you to hear them for yourself. Here's a few examples of their contributions to these conversations. And I do have to let you know that most of these clips are coming from a hearing from May 19th of 2021. This was a hearing about the financial aspects of the fossil fuel industry. And I had a bunch more clips for you about that, but we're kind of getting into the weeds. But yeah, most of these clips are going to be from May 19th. But here's an example. Here's Representative Bruce Westerman of Arkansas.
What we're really talking about today is an industry that provides reliable and affordable energy to our nation. This is an industry that contributes to almost 10 million jobs and plays a vital role in our daily lives. In fact, we cannot conduct virtual hearings like this without the fossil fuel industry. And of course, when myself and my colleagues included travel to Washington, D.C., We rely on this industry to fly or to drive here.
Now check out how Representative Yvette Harrell of New Mexico frames her question with her conclusion already baked in.
Many of my Democratic colleagues have stated that green energy jobs can replace the loss of traditional energy jobs, like the 134,000 oil and gas jobs in my state. Many also say that we need to be transitioning to a completely carbon-free energy grid. Can you tell me and the committee why both of those ideas are completely fantasy?
You know, in all of these hearings, none of the Republicans were really listening to the witnesses. The Republican minds were clearly made up. And all of the discussions with witnesses that I've played for you today, which in my opinion were rational discussions of legitimate concerns, they just kept getting dismissed by Republicans. So here's another example. Here's Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona. And this guy's in a leadership position. He's the top Republican on the House Committee on Natural Resources Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations.
There are some people who have made environmentalism a religion. Rather than focus on solutions that can make lives better for people, some would prefer to vilify an industry that provides immeasurable benefits to people's livelihood and the function of modern-day society.
He also said,
the other side looks at globalism, this environmental movement globally. So it makes more sense to me, at least, and for some from the folks I come from, that we produce it cleaner, more efficiently than anybody else in the world. And so that geopolitical application, if you're an environmentalist, you want more American clean oil and gas out there versus Russian dirty or Chinese dirty gas.
What? Yeah, I'm sure the citizens of Huntington Beach are really thankful that we have all this clean oil washing up on the shores. Yeah. Clean American oil. But here's part of the calculus here. I think it's a factor. Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona, he's taken $144,000 at least that we know of from people in the electric utilities industry. Representative Bruce Westerman of Arkansas, he's taken over $280,000 that we know of from people in the oil and gas industry. Representative Yvette Harrell has taken over $375,000 from people in the oil and gas industry that we know of. And to compare, the oil and gas and utility industries don't show up at all on Katie Porter's top 20 industries list. Same with Representative Mike Levin, who we heard a lot from today too. The people who don't take legal bribes from people in the oil and gas industry asked real questions and got us all of the useful information from these hearings that I played for you today. Basically, when it comes to the Republicans, here's Representative Pete Stauber of Minnesota. He's the top Republican on the House Committee on Natural Resources Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources. He's also someone who's taken over $143,000 that we know of from people in the oil and gas industry. And he summed up what the Republican Party wants to do when it comes to fossil fuels.
I can certainly provide a summary of things that will help keep energy prices down. Issue onshore and offshore lease sales, reinstate the presidential permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, renew our commitment to exporting American energy instead of importing foreign energy, reform a broken permitting process, and stop burdening domestic producers.
And when I sit back and look at the big picture, this same week that I've been producing this episode is the week that the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the BIF, was passed in the House and now it's law. And so in episode 240, I read most of the energy-related provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And the big story that I found in there is that it's now law that the United States is on a path to transition to a, quote, clean hydrogen economy, unquote. Now, truly clean hydrogen is possible. In fact, husband Joe, who you all know is a utility-scale solar engineer, told me this morning that his company is getting contacted for projects to provide solar power to make hydrogen. And so that can absolutely play a beneficial part in a transition away from fossil fuels. But as this episode and the oil that spilled all over my home beaches illustrates, the problems with fossil fuels are more than the burning of them for energy. We're doing extremely risky things to get oil and gas out of the ground. And the infrastructure bill blazes a path for our country to ensure that we are going to keep doing these dangerous things because it not only allows, but forces our government to invest in hydrogen projects that make the hydrogen from fossil fuels. That's called blue hydrogen, and it's a fucking scam to keep the fossil fuel industry in existence. While I was creating this episode, the leaders of the World Trade System countries, or the West, or the United Nations, whatever you want to call them, but they were meeting to plot our collective future at the UN Climate Change Conference, the COP26. And guess what? This blue hydrogen scam, this bailout for the fossil fuel industry, it's not a United States specific thing. So here's a reporter interviewing Boris Johnson this week. Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He's the leader of the UK's Conservative Party, just like the Republicans are the United States' Conservative Party. And Boris Johnson has been described as the UK's version of Donald Trump. Although, to be fair, I do find Boris to be much smarter, calculated, and articulate than Trump. And so I don't think that comparison really entirely fits. But regardless, here's a part of that interview that took place with Boris Johnson this week.
Your Scottish secretary has said 100% we need to have it done. We cannot run away from oil and natural gas. Doesn't that fly in the face of everything you're telling me now? That we do actually have to fly away from those CO2
There's a future for hydrocarbons if you liberate the hydrogen from the carbon and you sequester the carbon. That's what we're going to do. We have massive plans for creating green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, and for carbon capture and storage.
So when I look at the big picture, that appears to be the plan of those that serve the multinational fossil fuel companies. The Republicans, as a party in the 117th Congress, are telling us in no uncertain words that they're trying to expand drilling. They want to expand the fossil fuel transportation network. They want to expand the number of people outside the United States that the fossil fuel companies can sell our oil to, the oil that we assume all the local risks to drill for, so that the shareholder class that they serve can profit. And they will greenwash it with blue hydrogen. We've now seen the evidence of this plot in a law signed this week in the United States and in public statements from our country's daddy country, the United Kingdom. And these are all people, Boris Johnson and the Republicans, they're all on the same side of all of this. The Republicans are the party of drilling expansion. And it is also the party that the common wisdom and all of the polling is saying that us American voters are likely to give our next Congress control of. But the election of the 118th Congress is still a year away. Expanding the power of these Republicans and moving forward with this cynical plan for a blue hydrogen economy instead of an actual renewable one that eliminates the threats to our coasts and all of the businesses and people who depend on them, that's a choice, not a prophecy. And I'm hoping that for the sake of my home beaches and your home beaches and the creatures that live in the ocean and the stability of the climate that our infrastructure was built in and for, I hope for the sake of all of us and for all of those things that we start communicating with the people begging for our votes and our money, that this is something that we care about and we start voting accordingly. Because the Republican Party is actively working against all of us that want to transition our country off of fossil fuels, despite all of our promises to the world that we would not only do so, but lead the world in that effort. They've come up with a different plan. They did not discuss it with us as voters, but it's this hydrogen thing. That is the life raft of the fossil fuel industry. And we have now seen evidence of it being an international effort. And so as long as these people in this version of the Republican Party remain lawmakers, the rest of the world can't and won't take our word seriously when it comes to transitioning to a clean energy economy. They won't look to us to lead this effort or world affairs, and quite frankly, they really shouldn't. The people making our laws in one of our two main political parties are at least, you got to hand it to the Republicans, being honest in telling the world that they intend not to lead the effort, but to actively undermine it. And so they aren't even participating in these debates. They aren't listening or learning. They have made up their minds in lockstep. And so with Republicans in charge, we shall not lead. Republicans in a world that is working together on a global project to transition all of us, off of fossil fuel burning and drilling are a threat to the standing of the United States as global leader. And so if you want us to lose our global power, if you want to keep oiling up our beaches, if you want to experience more and more intense extreme weather events, then vote Republican. Because they are telling us exactly who they are and what they plan to do. And I think we'd be wise to believe them. Before I wrap this up, I would like to once again thank all of our producers of Congressional Dish, especially those of you who have been producing for a long time and regularly. I could not be doing this without you. And I would like to issue a special thanks to longtime producer of this show, Stephen McMahon of Oregon, who is now our executive producer on episode 241, the 20th anniversary of the Patriot Act. For those of you that don't know, all producers that contribute $535, that can be lump sum or cumulative, but for every $535 that you contribute to Congressional Dish, you can pick a episode that you are especially proud of and put your name on it. And so you will be a producer right there in the show notes alongside me. And I am proud to share the byline with those of you who are helping me at that level. And so I am very happy to see Stephen McMahon's name on the 20th anniversary of the Patriot Act episode. And he sent in an email to go along with his executive producer credit. He said, Jen, in your latest episode, you mentioned that most members of Congress still there have been promoted up. That made me think of the book, The Peter Principle, except now people are being promoted past their level of incompetence. Not sure it made me think of that connection, but there it is. As always, your podcast is not only informative, but better yet, makes me see things in a different light. Sometimes it is hard stretching the brain muscle. Always a fan, Stephen McMahon. Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I will put your name on that episode, and feel free to put that credit on your LinkedIn or anywhere else that you want it to be. We keep track of all of our executive producers, and if contacted, it's a real credit and we will vouch for you. So again, thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Let's just hope that our Congress gets better someday, because I'm really tired of telling you bad news. So let's hope that I find some good things in the infrastructure bill now that it's law, because I will be diving back into that. But before I can get back into the now infrastructure law, there's another regime change that is happening, and there was a bill signed into law related to it. And so I'm going to be researching that as fast as I can and making that episode for you. So yeah, thanks for supporting this work, and I will talk to you very soon. Take care. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if the lie is alright, in the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.